All right, now let's move into this last episode then of the Napoleonic saga. I'll really start out, I suppose, with the painting that we've been using all along, which really is supposed to say it all. We think because we seeing is believing, and so we look at this painting, which is probably one of the best known paintings of the Napoleonic saga. We go to the Louvre and you can hardly muscle your way in front of it. You've got 30 Chinese, there's a queue of Japanese, people from out of Mongolia. I mean, everyone is standing there. This is next to the Mona Lisa. I suppose it's the painting that people come to see. So it is a painting that packs a huge amount of power, but of course it's a very false document. It's more interesting, less for what it shows us than for what it doesn't show us. The people, for example, who were there and who aren't shown, and the people who weren't there and are shown, and in fact what didn't happen, which is this, and what didn't happen with these with the sisters, of course, were carrying the train, not the ladies in waiting. So all of these things have been manoeuvred by Napoleon. Now, is this a surprise from the man who said history is a set of lies agreed upon? Now, the English also got into the act with this when they sort of saw the power of the visual media that Napoleon had started to manipulate, and so you get the English using the cartoon methods for the same process. And so here you have King Joseph, and there you've got our three sisters here, shown as the three graces cavorting. Josephine is this fat pig. You've got the Pope as a sort of Dotty Joe character. This Napoleon again looking ridiculous. You've got the Confederate States of the Rhine holding up the train. Fouché is over here. So this again is an attempt to manipulate opinion via visual media. Now, what Napoleon, I suppose, really is attempting to do with this is to fix an image of himself in the minds of France and of Europe. At a time when identity was something which slid around very quickly, and because remember this 19th century, the end of the 18th and the 19th century, is a time when one regime follows another very quickly, right? We've had the cataclysm of the French Revolution, which the French try and export to the other, creaking monarchies. The revolution is overthrown, you have the Directoire, then Napoleon overthrows the Directoire and becomes first consul. So you're in a very fluid political situation, and indeed the identities of the main players is very fluid. And one of the things that I would like to sort of emphasise when we look at this painting is that most of the people portrayed and the portrayers, in other words, the artists, the choreographers, they all survive Napoleon. The person who disappears very quickly from this painting is the man who is centre stage. Now, Napoleon, what I'm going to also talk about in this lecture is the way in which he captured the public imagination and the way in which he foresaw the use of all of visual arts for propaganda, which was something that's obvious for us, but was not obvious at the time. And indeed, his painting of himself as emperor is indeed revolutionary. Now, I would like to look then at some of these people who managed to survive all of these regimes from the cataclysm of the revolution right through to the restorations of the Bourbon, and not just survive but thrive as well, while Napoleon is sort of sitting on St. Helena writing his memoirs, which are again a great sort of propaganda tool, which will reshape again what he sees as his contribution to history. Now, one of these extraordinary survivors, and someone who is extremely instrumental in that painting that we just saw, the painting of the Sacre, or the coronation of Napoleon, is of course Jacques-Louis David. who starts out as he's orphaned very early on. His father's killed in a duel, and this painting of him is interesting. He's someone who is wounded in a duel himself, and a kind of abscess appears on his face, which means that can't speak very well. He's a mumbler, and a mumbler at a time when someone who wanted to prove their wit and cleverness in the salon of Paris had to be able to speak clearly and be used to the wit and repartee. He couldn't, and so he turns his considerable talents into art. Now, he is someone who is very much to the left. He's someone who works with Maximilien Robespierre. He will vote the death of the king. And in fact, what is so interesting with all of these survival stories is that finally, when you get the Bourbon, the whole circle has turned, and you get the end of Napoleon, the kings are brought back, the brothers of Louis XVI are brought back. Who do they end up with as their chief of police, their prime minister and their painter? The people who voted for the death of their brother. So it's a most extraordinary sort of cycle. So David also was very instrumental in voting the death of aristocrats, and it was he who voted the death of the Beauharnais, the husband of Josephine, thus freeing Josephine up for Napoleon. Now, we have this extraordinary painting of this revolutionary fervour, which was already fermenting even before the fall of the Bastille. What you have here is the Oath of the Horatii, which is in the Louvre. The story behind it, very briefly, is that the Romans were fighting. It's not the Sabines, but one of the, I think it was the people from Alba Longa, and rather than having two armies massacre each other, they chose three champions. These are the three Horatii Roman brothers who will fight the three, I think they're Curati. Now, the problem here is that the three brothers are swearing on the naked blade of the sword of the father, but on the other side you have this wilting group of women, and they look at the contrast between them is it's all sort of male bonding, sort of energy, testosterone, violence and everything, all happening over here with diagonals and, salutes, and over here you've got this sort of collapsing group of the women, and they're collapsing because of the intricacy. One of these women here is actually the sister of one of the brothers who will be killed, but she's actually married to one of these who will also be killed, and she's the sister of one of these who's betrothed to one of the others who'll be killed. So, they can all sort of see it all coming, as most women can. Now, what we have here then is this very much this idea of sacrifice for the fatherland, of sacrifice for a principle which goes beyond you, something bigger than you. And he's returning very deliberately to the Rome of the early Republic, when, before it had become corrupted and, with Nero and these under the Empire. So this idea then of swearing to sacrifice one's own life for the ideals. Now, of course, what he is trying to say is that the same situation now as pertained to ancient Rome is happening now in Paris. We need people who are citizens, right, before being individuals, and this is your duty. So that's why now I want you to look at these three arches that you're going to get, and this use of this kind of salute, which eventually will be taken up by Hitler, and also Hitler will also take up some of the extraordinary stage-managed events of the French Revolution. Now, we get also from David, in other words, this rabid revolutionist, great friend of Robespierre, who, at the death of Marat, is persuaded to paint the portrait of Marat. Remember, Marat was one of the great sort of rabble-rousers who wrote the first sort of newspaper of the Revolution, L'Ami du Peuple. He'd spent a lot of his life in the kind of sewers underground, being chased by the royal police, and had contracted a kind of dermatitis, which meant that he had to always be soaking in a bath. It wasn't that he was clean. People didn't spend time in baths washing in these days. One spent there for medicinal reasons only. And of course, Charlotte Corday comes in and dives him in his bath. So what we have here then is all of this, the horror of what Marat was as a person, sending hundreds of thousands, well not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds of people to the guillotine without mercy, hunting people down, this sort of revenge more or less that he had from his early life. He's seen here as a Christ-like figure. If you think of the figures of Christ coming out of the tomb, the resurrection, or you think of the Pietà of Christ in the arms of Mary, this is a sort of a hybrid of those two genres. So here we have then the martyr of the revolution, in all of his horror, all of the the naked body with the sheet, which really has begun to look very much like a shroud, and the table on which he is writing looks very much like his tombstone, Marat, with the name David underneath. So he's managed to reduce everything to the bare minimum, but represent them allegorically as well as realistically. The letter that he was writing, to liberate some people, and all of these, which has become a table looking like a tombstone. And he's managed to eliminate everything here so that the emphasis is on this body, the deadness of this body, the weight of the dead body falling towards us. Now, David also produced this very quickly. He was a citizen David. They said, do something. We need an image of our great martyr. And one of the first great shows that were put on of the revolution was the funeral or burial of Marat. Now, his body was rotting very quickly because of this sort of dermatitis that he had, but not to be put off. David stage manages the whole thing, has the dead body there with the gaping wound. It's all millions of people sort of file past this putrefying body. So it's all sound and fury and light. So in other words, he's going to be the ideal person to turn on the coronation when the time comes. Now, he also is someone who turns his hand to designing costumes when he's not actually painting these figures of to be revered. Remember, the church had been banned at this time. There was no religion was allowed. Priests had to forswear, so that they wouldn't say mass. And so therefore you actually got Marat as the kind of new Christ, I suppose, of the revolution. But he also turns his hand to drawing these ridiculous costumes that the revolutionaries and the consulat dressed themselves up in. They saw themselves as the new Romans. Now, David had a flourishing studio. In other words, he had a lot of young artists who worked with him, and one of them is Jean-Antoine Gros, who will be very, very important in the sort of hagiography, I suppose, of Napoleon. Now, this is an early painting by Gros, and here he represents the Republic, all right, who of course is a woman, right? All these allegorical figures are female. She's seen as a sturdy woman, very different from the Virgin Mary. She's quite sporty looking here, a woman who, looks as though she could do a few miles. Also, we've got the Phrygian bonnet, relating to the slaves who were freed, had their bonnet taken off. The triangle here, which relates to the rule of reason, and of course the ivy, which relates to being faithful to these ideals. So this figure, they were searching very much for a figure to incarnate the idea of the Republic. Now, David is very taken by Bonaparte when he meets him about the time of the campaign of Italy, mainly because of what he sees as his classical features. Now, David is a neoclassic painter. He is his return to the sort of simplicity of the ancient world, but he sees Bonaparte's face also as representing this. He didn't ever manage to finish, unfortunately, this painting, but you do get that wonderful sort of look of Napoleon, very different from the one that we are used to, this tubby little balding character. Now, it is Gros who will be asked to accompany Bonaparte, and he is the citizen Bonaparte, the general of the Revolutionary Army, on his first foray into Italy. Remember when they're trying to get the Austrians out of Italy? And at the Battle of Arcola, the Austrians are on one side and Napoleon grabs the standard and races across the bridge to pull his soldiers with him. In fact, they take the bridge, and it is one of the great victories which will lead up to the Peace of Amiens. Now, what was interesting about this is that Napoleon didn't just take an army with him when he went. He already had the idea that he needed the pictures to show what he'd done. All right, rumour was enough. It wasn't enough to have the troops under your control. You had to be able to disseminate this vision of yourself. Now, I mean, that was quite an unusual thing for a young man of 25, 26 to have thought of these things. So he had a group of artists, and Gros was the most important. And he also dictates exactly what he wants. I want myself in the centre of these. Of the painting under the Republican flag. And indeed this is what we have. We have an image of a man who is totally calm in the centre of the storm. All right, we have the army, the battle which is surging around him. If it's not the battle, it's the sort of the wind, it's all happening, but calm at the centre of it all is this young man, and you get this with this vertical stroke of his body. But you don't want someone who is utterly still. And so with the torsion of his body, you get this sense of dynamism as well instilled into this idea of control. And so you get energy and vision. And he's looking back, of course, to his soldiers, looking back to the past, but he's thrusting onto the future with his sword. And indeed, this is how he saw himself as the future leader of the revolution. And he makes sure that people understand this with the emphasis on the revolutionary colours, bleu, blanc, red, white and blue, and the revolutionary flag. So here we have this idea of a leader, all right? He's not just someone in the army, he's not just a good soldier, he is someone who can be relied on, who is dynamic, energetic, young, and a visionary as well. And in fact, he's very much like the romantic hero with his hair flying in the breeze. A tremendous image, I think, that really encapsulates all of the sort of the genius, I think, of Napoleon. Now, what he also did was to, in Paris, you have to have somewhere to exhibit these paintings, and the revolution had already turned the Palace of the Louvre into the museum, all right, a museum, where the goods of the king suddenly became public property, and people could experience themselves as citizens by now going into a royal abode and taking it over and looking at images which before had been private. So Napoleon uses this to exhibit these images of himself, opens it up free on Sundays, and so hundreds of thousands of people go through this. And you must never underestimate in the 19th century the number of people who went through to the salon and these exhibitions. It makes the audiences of our blockbusters look pathetic, seriously, by comparison. Everybody went, whether you were a worker or an aristocrat, you were there jostling in front of these paintings. Now, as we know, Napoleon came back and was general for a while, but realises he needs to keep in the public view. We've spoken about this. He decides to go to Egypt to block the British trade routes, but also to make himself visible again as the great conqueror. Again, he takes with him boats full of people who aren't soldiers. We have astronomers, botanists, physicists, mathematicians, translators, artists. In fact, he even takes printmakers, and he takes print face, which is done both in Latin, in Western script, and also in Arabic script as well. So he was already thinking of writing his newspapers and publishing them when he was over there. He really had thought of everything, and considering that the whole expedition was dreamed up and sent off within 6 months, it was amazing how much he managed to pack in. Now, what happened? I've told you about this. When he finally gets to Jaffa, the plague breaks out, and he is in a very difficult situation. He can't continue to besiege the city of Acre, and this is the time when, according to the Americans and British historians at the time who try and blacken his reputation, he gives poison to some of the plague victims so that they won't be taken and left to be tortured and butchered by the local inhabitants, which indeed did happen. For the people as stragglers of the army, dreadful things were done to them, as you can imagine. Also, remember that while he's in Egypt, he hears that if it's the now or never, if he wants to take over as first consul, take over the directoire, which is in power, is struggling, and his spies have told him, you must come back. So he leaves his army and comes back. So years later, not so much later, he needs to justify, A, the fact that he left his army, and B, these stories about having poisoned the soldiers. And so he asked Gros, who was with him all the time in Alexandria, in Cairo and at Jaffa, to produce the painting. And again he says, I want myself in the centre of the hospital, touching the wounds of one of the ill people. Now, before I actually go into the painting, we need to look at the date. The date's very significant. 1804 is, of course, the date of his coronation. Right, so this this was exhibited 6 months before the coronation to, in many ways, show what a wonderful man Napoleon is, and other things as well, as we will see. Well, what do we see here? We see him in the hospital. So you have the most unusual thing of the commanding general coming into a hospital in the first place, but secondly, even more, in a hospital where the plague is raging. The people understood how contagious the plague was. Now, Bonaparte actually did this. He went in, he wanted to tell people, look, it's all in your imagination virtually. Look, I can touch you and I will not catch the plague. He even helped take out some dead bodies to prove, it's all about courage, get your act together and get better. Now, what you have here is something that the 19th century, and Gros in particular, is very good at. You have the bodies of the dead, the half dead, and then the people who are about, will eventually die. So you've got this gradation of agony and dead bodies, but also a very ecumenical sort of thing insofar as he shows the Arab doctors also handing out medicine as well. All right, and he's very careful about this because he was very interested in this civilization. It's a propaganda painting of the highest level. First of all, remember these arches, all right? Gros, of course, takes up the structure of his master David, and there is always the hand reaching out. In the background, we have this exotic nature of where this takes place in Egypt. And this expedition of Bonaparte to Egypt, is seen as the beginning of Orientalism, the beginning of the West taking over the East. And in fact, the fundamentalists, even now in Egypt, see the invasion of Cairo by Bonaparte as the turning point. The other more liberal Egyptians see it as a sort of an opening up of their culture towards the West. But the idea here, you have the revolutionary flag fluttering in this extraordinary, exotic landscape. In other words, Bonaparte has annexed the East for France. All right, so that's a very, very powerful message. And of course, Dunant will bring back the first drawings of the temples, publish the first book, right, The Expedition to Upper Egypt, and will bring back all of those objects which will be exhibited in the Louvre, the basis of the Louvre Egyptology exhibition. So there's all of this Orientalism, which is extremely important and which will be exploited by Napoleon later on. But we have him here with doctors, and that's something we'll see later as well. The doctors, one of the doctors is trying to pull him away. He's touching the infected armpit of this naked man. Now, of course, there are two people who do this. The first one is, of course, Christ, all right? This idea of healing. In other words, Napoleon is showing himself not just as a military general, and certainly not one who's had his fleet burnt by Nelson, but also what is important is that the kings of France had this tourmological power. In other words, they had the power to heal. And after the coronation, each king was when he was crowned, the scrofular and the unwell would line up outside Notre Dame and be touched by the king. So the fact that this painting was actually exhibited just before the coronation is very significant. Of course, Napoleon's not going to do that. He's not going to, try and carry on with the king's tricks and make himself look absolutely stupid. But there is this reference already in this painting to himself as someone who has these powers. Right? So Napoleon then is trying to sort of place himself in this structure of the great dynasties of France. Now, this is only one painting of this propaganda that we're going to get. This is a long lecture, by the way. I'm sorry. I'll try and speak fast. Now, you get a number of other paintings that aren't by the top artists of the time. Now Napoleon is going to use Gérard, Guérin, Gros, Giraudet, Ingres, David. I mean, the panoply of the great artists of the time, Isabey, are all going to work in his propaganda machine. And then you're going to have all of these other people as well. So you have sort of high-level paintings that go to the Louvre. You have popular paintings like this, which are going to be exhibited elsewhere and become engravings. And then you have little figurines that we'll see. Well, what we have here is Napoleon recalled. Here he is sitting with a lyre, strumming it on the banks of the Nile. And here is France, of course, because by now France was losing all of the what he had gained for them at the Battle of Arcole and so on. And so fury is pursuing France. History is there scribbling away. And so he is being recalled by history, by France, to come back. Please come and save us. So he says, oh, all right. Now, we have then Napoleon, who is beyond being just a soldier, Napoleon the healer. Here we have Gros painting also Napoleon the soldier, all right? So he wants all sides of this big deal that he endeavoured in Egypt. Right? He wants to milk it for absolutely every element possible. So here you have this story. Remember the pyramids, the Battle of the Pyramids, soldiers from those pyramids, 40,000 years contemplate you. Murat here always is a contrast, and he always says, I want myself in the centre of the painting on a white horse. Gros knows exactly what he's to do. So you have again the exoticism of these people imploring the might, massed might of civilization over here. Now, we also have another very important painter, Anne-Louis Giraudet Triosson de Roussy. Bit of a mouthful. A lot of people, of aristocratic people, have female names in France. Like if you think of Valérie Giscard d'Estaing, Hyacinth, all of these names. What else have we got? Sort of show that they come from the aristocracy. Now, he also is a painter of this, and here you get his sort of other homoerotic paintings. All of them were. He was sort of more interested in that sort of thing. But here you get the sort of the fury of the battle, but the utter exoticism of it as well. And also a number of paintings, portraits brought back by painted by Giraudet of these Mamluks. Now Napoleon actually brings back several Mamluk as his servants, and one of them actually is at the coronation and guards his door virtually right up into the time of Waterloo. So there's always this reference to me as the conqueror of Egypt, right? Now, we have one last one by Guérin, another great painter of the time. There was an uprising in Cairo. Napoleon puts it down in a very bloody manner, but he doesn't actually show this here. Here it is, he's pardoning the rebels, the survivors, but here he is by now in his trademark costume. Right now, he's one thing that's so incredibly clever about Napoleon is that he gets a kind of logo, which is, of course, the grey greatcoat and the tricorn hat worn across his head. And so he's absolutely recognisable everywhere, and he deliberately dresses down rather than dressing up, except right at the end, where he sort of rather lost the plot. He actually dresses like this. So now, of these Egyptian motifs, we have Napoleon the statesman, Napoleon the soldier, Napoleon civilizing the East, Napoleon annexing the east of France, and Napoleon the Christ-like healer. So all of those things, the saviour of France also France imploring him to come back. He wants to keep this very much in the eye of people, and so he commissions all of the great sort of luxury métier, crafts, to produce images which will relate to his conquest of Egypt. So here you have this beautiful Sèvres set with all of these Egyptian motifs, and each one of these little paintings here shows a different scene of Egypt. All right, so it's sort of a bit like a magazine of the time, I suppose. You know, you're at a dinner party, and what have you got there? I've got Napoleon, at the Battle of Aboukir. Oh, well, I've got the one at Jaffa, So I mean, it's extraordinary propaganda, and of course he sends these as gifts to the other heads of Europe. Just want to show you another one. There's a very high, but the utter exoticism of this, of course, is lost on us. For people who had never really been out of Europe, seeing these images was quite extraordinary. And of course, he doesn't just use the minor arts. He works on the city of Paris itself. Here we have the Châtelet fountain with the sphinxes, which will actually be put in later, but which were designed during his time. You have all the streets, a certain part of Paris. Some of you will have been with me. In the Sentier, you get the streets of Cairo, of Rosetta, of Aboukir. You get the first Cairo places and so on. So you really cannot go anywhere or do anything in Paris without remembering the great Egyptomania of Napoleon. And this is at the Battle of Marengo. And he now employs David for these really, the portraits of himself like this. He takes on David. He's seen Marat. He knows what David can do, how he can move people. And so here, he actually says again to David, I want myself on a fiery horse, right? So remember, the Battle of Marengo was that he crosses the Alps very quickly in the middle of winter, gets over there, surprises the Austrians, and will win this epic battle. Not always from his own brilliant engineering of events, but probably by the use of some of his great generals, as we'll see in a moment. Now, what you see here is exactly what you saw with that painting of him at the Battle of Arcole. The whole military campaign and everything is incarnate in this one figure of one man. Right? We no longer have a battle scene, we don't have the army, we don't have horses, we just have Napoleon, right? And he's taking on a whole number of ideas here. By now, he is absolutely determined to ride his destiny out to the end and to take over the supreme power in France. And so he wants to develop a lineage for himself. Now, who does he go to? He goes to the other great conquerors of French history and of history of the Western world. Who else had had the genius to lead an army across the Alps or across mountains? It was Carolus Magnus, Charlemagne, who he will reference very much in his coronation paintings. All right, the great figure who has reunified the Roman Empire, which was crumbling. The other one, of course, is Hannibal, who leads the Carthaginians across the mountains to fight the Romans. So he might not be of royal blood, but he belongs to a much more select group, the great military geniuses of history. And so the horses, it's written in stone, all right? It's not written in paper, it's in stone. Now, he uses deliberately the equestrian mounted painting, which usually kings used to use. Remember Louis XIV, the kings of Spain, Velasquez, paintings of Charles V and so on. They're always on a horse. This is this idea of the hunt as being symbolic of being in charge of the army. So there he is on a white horse again. Now, the horse isn't just trotting along. He's rearing up across the picture plane. So you get this sense of energy, of dynamism, but you get also the central axis is, of course, again, Napoleon. I want myself calm on a fiery horse. So you get these enormous fiery horse and the calm, slender figure of Napoleon utterly in control. Control of the horse, which represents nature, which represents the powers of turmoil that he will eventually, govern, but also the powers of nature. Notice the swirl of the clouds and the swirl of his cape, pulling irresistibly towards the future as like his raised hand. And again, you will remember the oath of the Horatii by David, right? This imperious finger pointing, which also, of course, references Michelangelo's creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. So all of these things are there. For the learned who watch it, for who see it, they will get these references, but you don't need to get these references to actually understand that here is a powerful man, and he is now not just that winsome young general. This horse, all of these paintings were commissioned by the King of Spain, and this is a horse which was given to him by the King of Spain. It's not the horse that he used. By the way, he rides in a very particular manner, which is interesting. I'll just sort of show you something later about that. Now, we will see one of these versions in the exhibition at the NGV. There were 4 versions of it. The horse changes and the cape changes as well, and it's slightly changed here. Now, by 1850, of course, you have the Bourbons who've come back into power, and they want to counter the image of Napoleon. And so here you have de la Roche. You see Napoleon as a very unheroic figure, looking very depressed, and this is more realistic. In fact, he did go over the Alps on a donkey, but donkeys, of course, were sure-footed. He wasn't going to, break his neck going over. But all of that, there's no energy. It's all sort of flaccid and sort of, depressed, and the colours, and there's the peasant and the donkey. It's all very much the small man that they are looking at. And there's great emphasis on how damn cold it is, too. Now, Gros is also called in to work on the Battle of Marengo. And so here we have Napoleon. Again, now what's interesting here is the way in which his stirrup he's using it slightly differently. He used to have his foot right down. He was a great horseman. He'd spent most of his life riding up and down the incredibly steep landscape around Corsica and could stay on a horse in any position, whereas the British grab this and sort of say, because of the way in which he uses his reins and his stirrups, he couldn't ride. There's all of these things that, to be a man, you have to be able to have your foot in one stirrup or something like that. So you don't get that. But here, again, you have him here as consul reviewing the troops, again, but very much a statesman-like image. But also Napoleon by now uses this horse, this young Arab horse, who will stay with him through all of his main battles, right up to the Battle of Waterloo, when he will be captured by Wellington's troops, well treated actually, better treated than Napoleon, sent off to stud, doesn't seem to do much, but anyhow he ends up with one of his hoofs as the ashtray of the grenadiers. And his skeleton, I think, is still there. Now, Napoleon, again, used a small horse, not because he was a small man, which is what the British want to say. It's because he was, his presence on the field. Remember I said to you that Wellington said his presence on the field was worth 40,000 soldiers. His manoeuvring, he wanted a horse that he could manoeuvre in and out that was fast and very biddable, not one of these clunkers that the heavy cavalry used, particularly under Kellerman. Now we have remember we were talking about the Battle of Marengo, which he elevates as one of the great battles, and of course he calls his horse Marengo. And one of the people who actually won it for him was a young general called Desax, who was summoned just at the last moment. The Austrians basically had beaten Napoleon. Desax came along, saw what was happening and charged, and it was really from his final charge that the battle was turned around, and he was killed right at the last moment. So he was a very charismatic figure. He'd been in Cairo with Napoleon. Napoleon, even though he takes on everyone else's victories, he feels he has to do honour to Desax. There's an outcry. And so he has this painting commissioned by a lesser painter. You'll see Brock, not many people had heard of him, but even then he's still in the centre with the expiring Desax, and of course the Orientalism here. Also, you get a series of allegories of Marengo, right? It's now the war, which has been won by the genius, Napoleon sweeping over the Alps, forget about falling off and all of that. And so here we have France looking distraught, but Napoleon riding in like a Roman emperor with victory, like Pallas Athena above her head, and fame trumpeting his story over here, and history over in the background about to write it all down. Now, if you didn't understand these things, and if you didn't actually go to the Louvre, and if you were living in the provinces, you still could have your bit of Napoleonica. He also managed to have a number of moulds of himself made, and they were always himself as the little general, with the hat, the hand in the waistcoat, and the grey redingote, which is the corporal's outfit. All right, he didn't dress as a general; he was one of the men. And so these little figurines are disseminated throughout the markets of France, and quite often in a humble abode you would have the plaster Virgin Mary on one end, and you'd have Napoleon on the other. This would be an upmarket version because, of course, it's painted. Well, we now get, I'm just going to try and get through this, we now get Napoleon, who has gone through the coup d'etat of the 18 Brumaire, which you all know about, and has become first consul. And the first consul's outfit is the red coat. And so when you see him in a red coat, that's when he's consul. Now, he needs another type of representation of himself, because it's not certain that people think that a good general is going to be a good ruler. Right? He needs to show himself as a statesman. And so here we've got rid of the clunking armour, there's no horse, he's in a very bare study. Again, he's someone who is looking at, we've surprised him, we've come into the room while he is reading all of his victories. Let's see, what did I win? And he's pointing to the truce of Lunéville, which will bring up the truce of Amiens, which is peace with England. So this peace with England was seen as a major strategic coup, which he wants to emphasise, and so that's why you have this. And if you're supposed to read it, you're supposed to go in and read this. At the same time, his sword has been put away. He still is the soldier, he has the sword, his gloves are off, but you get this sense of this quietly authoritative figure, again, all in this sort of verticality. There's no dynamism of diagonals here. It's calm, it's secure, there's a certain amount of pointing, but it's a very restrained gesture, after all, pointing to something on the page. So he is very much the scribe, you see, with the emphasis on the writing and so on. Now, he likes this image so much that he will get Ingres, no one else but Ingres, all right, and he pays very well Napoleon. At a time when people would be earning, say, let's say 10 euros a month, they didn't get that, but let's say he would be paying 100,000 for a painting, all right? He understood the power of these images. And so he now gets Ingres to paint a series of these, which are to be put up in the town halls of all of France, because he's already reorganised France according to these départements, and each one has a mairie, and each one has a painting of him. It's a bit like the Queen in one of those, those ghastly, wattle gown, yes. All right, so there he is in his red consul's outfit. Again, this referring to that particular victory. But here we've got supplements to it. We've got this one was relating to Liège. And in fact, he even had this one in Liège because he had got rid of the Austrians and given Liège a lot of money to open museums and things that he had. So he references that. But one thing that's come into it here is this chair, which is beginning to look uncannily like a throne. One of the best images we have of him is Isabey's painting in 1801 at Malmaison. He was notoriously difficult to sit. I think there's really only twice did he sit for a painting. I think he had about half an hour to get this likeness, and Ingres also managed to get about half an hour. He's probably had ADD or something. He probably would have been on Valium now, and we would never have had all of... All right, so we now get to the 1804, when he is finally realising his great dream of being emperor. And he has the Senate, which is a puppet organisation, votes him in May, and this ceremony is going to take place on the 2nd of December. So there's not a lot of time. When you think of how much time it takes to organise your child's wedding, you can imagine like this. There were something like 15,000 people attending this, and of course you had to negotiate the Pope, all right? Now, normally, of course, all the rulers who wanted to be blessed went to the Pope, but no, Napoleon has the Pope come to him. Why did he want this enormous ceremony? He didn't really need it. It's because he wants to nail it in the subconscious of his people, because this is such a time of shifting loyalties and shifting political structures that, as he said, a painting or a newspaper article is worth 1,000 words. So here we have then the painting. Now I just want to look at the expertise that he drew upon. He had to have choreography, and he turns to the great artists of the time, Isabey and David. Now, they had been involved in the great festivals of the Revolution. Religion had been abolished, and in the place of God and the Virgin Mary and the whole sort of panoply of saints, they had this one image of the Supreme Being, which is represented as wisdom. And so there were a couple of times a year, there would be these massive processions with massed choirs, with all of the symbolism, and you can see, and here you have wisdom sitting on a throne. Now, David had worked this out, that the wisdom is made of some kind of material which isn't combustible, and the throne is. So at a certain point he presses the button and the fireworks go up. Everything else burns except wisdom. So what I'm trying to say is that he was used to staging spectacular, literally spectacular events. And here we have the one that he staged for Robespierre. Robespierre also, of course, had ideas of glory. And people, you have the mass choirs, people all, massed in different colours, different things. Here you have the Supreme Being, which is being brought on a chariot, taken up to a hill. This is in front of the École Militaire, by the way, that the Eiffel Tower will now be over there. Up here, finally got the Tree of Liberty, and it's got a Phrygian bonnet on the top, and there's another effigy, and up here was Robespierre. So this extraordinary choreography, again, of a whole day's ceremony. You needed this for this. Now, what I think is quite interesting is this sketch, which David did for this. Now, David actually was at the ceremony. He actually was sketching, while everything was going on. But this was actually before, because they're actually trying to work out how they're going to set it up, right? Notre Dame looks really like a theatre. It's unrecognisable. And so what you have here is a very different view from what we end up with. First of all, the main moment here is Napoleon holding onto the sword of Charlemagne, right, in front of the Pope. Now this is something, putting his crown on his own head in front of the Pope. Now the Pope knew that this was going to happen. It wasn't a last minute decision. Napoleon never did that sort of thing. But it was a humiliating thing. He's got his back to the Pope. He's virtually treading on his toes. And he's got his hand on a sword at the same moment, twisting his body. He puts it I know it's exciting. He puts it on his own head, and then he's going to put it on Josephine's head as well. Over here you'll notice there are two angels, and you've got the pews. It doesn't really hang together very much. Now if we go back to this is a much more convincing image. The angels have gone. Have you noticed that? Yeah, so you know, get rid of them, and it works much better because they actually dwarfed the people who were there. You've got rid of the furniture here. You've just got the people, and of course you have this majestic moment, which is much more successful than this twisted body, sort of trying to is that where my crown is, and of course he's not a arrogant crowning himself. It's bestowing royalty on someone else, which was even a greater sort of image. And of course he doesn't have the sword in his hand, and the Pope looks a lot more comfortable as well. So it is an extraordinary image, which was practiced. They'd set up little clay figures. He used to come every day. And when he finally saw this painting, he said, "It's not a painting. You could walk in it." And he actually gives David the Legion of Honor for it. There's also lots of references in it as well. David is told to call upon Rubens' A Coronation of Maria de' Medici. Now, this is actually in the Louvre. There's a whole Medici cycle. And she, of course, was the last queen to be crowned in France. So therefore, he uses this iconography of these. It's very similar, if you actually look at it, the people behind holding the train. And I should have actually given you a close-up of Josephine. I just want you to have a look. She's got this very high, sort of late, sort of 17th century, 16th or 17th century collar made of lace, and the dress is very much based on that. See this collar here of Maria de' Medici. So there's references all the way along the line, placing himself and Josephine in this ideal. Now originally there were supposed to be four paintings, and this the reason you have Napoleon on the other side at the coronation is because David was commissioned also to do the distribution of the eagles the next day or a couple of days later. So here he is saluting from the left-hand side. Now this is the army. Now this was set up in the Champ de Mars. Unfortunately, it was an incredibly rainy day. Everyone was freezing, soaking wet, but it doesn't matter. The painting that we have is of an imperious Napoleon, again with that outreached arm, with this salute, which will again be taken up. As I said, the Nazis studied these revolutionary happenings, and particularly the Napoleonic happenings, when they were looking at using them for Hitler. And here he's presenting the army, and the army are all sort of saying, we swear that we will die for you, and they're being presented with the eagles of their legions, as you can see here. Now originally it was supposed to have victory hovering over and distributing flowers, and of course originally Josephine was in it, wasn't she? Well, by the time this is actually painted, Josephine's out of the painting because she's been divorced, and there's a kind of you've got this fellow thrusting his knee forward to try and fill up that space. Can you see? It's really quite interesting the way in which political things change between the ideas. I might not have a lot of time to talk about Fouché at the end, but anyway, I want to look at this image of Napoleon now commissions a whole series of paintings of himself in his coronation robes, which he sends out to the provinces as well. And the one that he likes the best is this one done by Ingres. Now, we are now a long way from that young man at the Battle of Arcole. We're a long way even from the man on the horse at Marengo. They were moving. We now have this immobile, static figure who is like an icon. So time has gone out of the image. It's an eternal image of power. All right? He has no expression. He doesn't meet our eyes. It's this cold, icon-like glance of God the Father. Now, the structure of this has many references. Now, at the time, this altarpiece from Liège was, from Antwerp actually, had been brought to Paris. Paris was going to be the centre of the arts. This is what Napoleon thought it should be. That's why he took all of these, the horses from St. Mark's and so on in Venice. And so you can see very clearly this image of God the Father on his throne, which would be recognisable in many ways to people who had been to the Louvre and seen this altarpiece. So you see very much this. But there are other references as well. First of all, there is the references to the ancient world, to Jupiter, the king of the gods. Of course, you have the laurel wreath and the crown, referencing the king of the gods, of course. This wasn't so unusual, referencing Rome. Rome was a reference point for most things in the 19th century. There's a great return to classicism. But what is much more interesting is his own emblems. He has the bee, which has replaced the fleur de lis, and he does this because he has to prove that he is a new lineage, a new dynasty. And about a couple of hundred years before, the tomb of the first king of France had been unearthed, and in it they'd found cicadas. And so he takes this on, he turns it into a bee because it's the symbol of resurrection and hard work, and so he has bees all over himself. He also creates the Legion of Honour, so that is his own system of honours, which replaces the ones that were distributed by the kings. More than all of this is that he has the paraphernalia of the kings of France when they were anointed kings. All right, there is the hand of justice, which usually had 2 fingers up in blessing, 2 fingers down caressing, and 1 finger out, which was supposed to represent punishment. He actually has the hand all up, which represents just simply power and acceptance. So he uses the symbols but changes them subtly. He has the sword of Charlemagne, and he's trying very much, remember on that horse he has Carolus Magnus written in the rocks. He's trying very much to reference Charlemagne as his reference point. Charlemagne, the person who had reunited the Western Roman Empire when it was crumbling at the time of Byzantium. So he sees himself in this role. And also we have the sceptre of the kings of France and the orb. Now there's more, as they say. At this time of great uncertainty, you had a lot of people who turned to astrology and superstition to try and read, what was going on, because religion to some degree had been discredited. And so here on the carpet you actually have the signs of the zodiac that were in the sky at the times of his greatest victories. Like Marengo, for example, will be there. Very interesting, different points that he thinks are important. And of course you have the great eagle of the legions. There's another painting I couldn't actually find, which has him sitting on the globe of the world, which is even slightly more, megalomaniac. He has series of these, and I'll have to skip through these. I'm not going to get through all of this. All of this is done by Gérard. Remember Gérard, who does all of those paintings of the royal family. He does about 5 versions, and this is the one that you're going to see by Girodet. This is Napoleon with the crown, with the sceptre, at the moment where he actually takes the oath, saying that a kind of republican oath in the church with the Pope there. The way in which he manipulated this ceremony and manipulated the Pope is pure genius, I can tell you. He actually asked David to do a painting, and this is what David produces. Napoleon doesn't like it very much, and it does look a bit sort of as though he's skipping lightly, and the crown looks a little bit strange too. All right, now we'll have to quickly whiz through these. Remember that Gérard now becomes his painter of choice for representing his family. So I'll just look through these, perhaps pausing with Madame Mother. We have several versions of Madame Mother, and remember she is represented here as the mother of Augustus Caesar, Agrippina. All right, so she's sitting there in her clothes are made to look a little bit like a Roman toga. The brother, King of Spain, the King of Holland, the King of Westphalia, all very much in this traditional, representation of a king with the ermine robes, with the crown. Same thing with his sister, Murat, even the Queen and the new child. Now, he also turns, of course, for propaganda to the city of Paris. He wants to make it a kind of a new Rome, and so copies the Roman monuments. You have the Trajan's column, becomes the column that represents his victory at Austerlitz, and he has himself on the top as a lawmaker. Right, in the toga. This is him, not as as a military man, but with the civil code. Of course, once the Bourbons take over, they chuck it down, break it. He comes back from the 100 Days, up it goes again. You could do a lecture on the statues on top of this column. Of course, he erects the Arc de Triomphe as well, which isn't actually built during his time. There was a strike, would you believe? And it's only built up to here by the time he marries Marie-Louise, and he has to have a kind of a plaster cast one above. He has a number of buildings, such as the Madeleine Church, built in neoclassic style. So if you've always wondered why you've got these buildings in the centre of Paris, it's because Napoleon is attempting to make Paris a new Rome. And he actually says, I want Paris not just to be the most beautiful city which exists, but to be the most beautiful city which has ever existed and ever will exist. All right? So he sees the big picture, so as to speak. Very, very briefly, all the decorative arts are used also as propaganda. This is what's called a nave or a nef, which has your knife and fork and your spices, if you're an emperor. And this is, I think this is his. Every possible emblem is shoved on here. You've got, first of all, the nave, the ship of state, okay? Here you've got the Napoleon N with the sunblast, or taking over Louis XIV's sunblast. You've got the bees of Napoleon. Here you've got it sitting on the rivers of the Seine and the Rhone. Here on either side is an engraving of the coronation, and on the other side you've got the distribution of the eagles. Up here you have victory heading off into the distance, and truth and justice discussing it all at the back. And on the top, these are all bees again. Same thing with the chairs. I haven't really got time to talk about this, but you can see the emblems again, the bees, and of course he takes over green as his colour because white and blue have already been taken by the Bourbons. He also says that paper, stone and paintings can be burnt or destroyed, but coins are immortal. And so for everything he does, he has sets of coins and medals struck and distributed throughout Europe. He even has things that he hasn't done. For example, he has himself at London, even though he never got there, but just in case he did, he has one struck. So this is him actually, with the tables of the law, giving this power to the Sanhedrin, in other words, helping the Jews in Paris. Here he is with the civil code. Snuff boxes, I mean, that's the most obvious thing that you can do to hand them out to people everywhere. All right, now we really come to one of the great sort of propaganda paintings of all time, 1807, the Battle of Eylau against the Prussians. Now, this was fought, as we said, in incredibly, I think it was -15 temperature, and there are 30,000 on one side, 20,000 on the other in one day, who died, mainly because of the immense use of cavalry under Murat, charging again and again and again, just mowing people down. When dawn breaks, the French are the only people on the battlefield. It's a technical victory. Napoleon knows that this is a disaster. He sort of says, another victory like this and we are totally undone. His reign is becoming more and more questioned in France. People who are younger and younger are being called up. So he needs to put his propaganda machine into overdrive. By the way, don't forget that Napoleon, when he's not fighting and doing all of this, he's also writing the newspaper articles for his own self-owned newspaper, the Moniteur. So he sends these things and he sets up a competition. Before I talk about this, I want to talk about the competition amongst all of the painters of the time. And he says, I want myself on a white horse in the centre. I want the enemy dead around me, and I want the medical corps behind me with the Hound of Eylau in the background going up in smoke. So all of the great painters put forward a version. It is Gros who wins, and the others, however, are exhibited. Now, what we have here is very interesting. We have, first of all, a battle painting. It's always after the battle, right? And he has to acknowledge the massacre. He has to. I mean, everyone now knows about the massacre of Eylau. And so it must be written into it. How do you have a massacre painting where you come out victorious? So what he does is he has the enemy dead. But he has, instead of his he has Murat, who represents sort of, power, who represents the cavalry, represents the strength of the army. But he's, again, a man on a white horse with Marengo, very much a contrast to Murat in his pale colours, the pale face lifted up to heaven, asking God. Now, he now communicates with God, sort of saying, what is this sort of massacre that is going on? He's literally above the melee. And not only that, he represents here doctors. Now, what we have here, these people with these big hats, that you'll get here, and this is Larry, the great surgeon who operated on the battlefields, who developed this form of amputation. I think he could do it in 10 seconds because he did it at the joints. Another one of the other doctors actually wanted to do it elsewhere, but this meant that you could do it quicker. You knew where he was because of the pile of limbs. Now, he was most successful. Wellington salutes him as he goes past. There's all these conventions, but also Napoleon at this time develops, first of all, the flying ambulance service and the fact that all wounded are looked after by the French medical corps, even wounded of the other side. Now, what's the point in having it? I've never understood these ideas of war. You kill and then you look after. Anyway, but this is what was worked out. And so he foregrounds these doctors rather than his generals in the background. So he's putting himself as a man of science, as a man who is for whom healing is extremely important. All right, so this then is trying to avoid the image of someone who has led to utter carnage. And of course, the enemy are absolutely incredulous. They can't believe they're being looked after by these lovely French people. And this man here is sort of saying, you have cured me, I will serve you. This is this moment where you get one of the Prussians who has been looked after. He's got a band-aid on, and he's at the feet, and he says, "Oh Caesar, I will serve you." So this is then sent and exhibited. All of these paintings are exhibited to the Louvre to try and show the other humane side of Napoleon. Well, Gros, who we saw, the great painter of Napoleon, of course, will survive Waterloo, will survive all of this, and goes on to do the great coronation paintings of Louis XVIII, as will Gérard, who painted all of the Bonaparte family, again does the coronation of Louis XVIII. What I think is so amazing is all of these people who survive from one to another. Now, I want to very quickly look at one of the great survivors, this man who is utterly feared by two of the great sort of tyrants of that era, Robespierre and Napoleon. They were both utterly scared of him, and in fact, if you actually look at all of the events that happened between the revolution right up to the I think up until 1848, when Louis Philippe comes to power, they are dominated by this incredibly shadowy figure, a person who never actually wanted to be right on the stage, but by his manipulation and by his spy service actually is the mover behind most of the events. In many ways sort of precipitates the fall, well, he does, the fall of Robespierre. Who is he? He is a man who is born in the provinces, enters the Horatian order of the priesthood. He doesn't actually take final vows, is a teacher. You've got to look out for them. He's a very plain man, he sort of with hardly any hair, pale eyes, pale skin, evidently very, very unattractive character. He, at the time of the revolution, he meets Robespierre, manages to, first of all, he's teaching for years, in a Christian college. He throws that aside when he realises that now is the time for the revolution, and lets his hair grow back from his tonsure and becomes one of the right-hand men of Robespierre. He votes. It is he who sets up the vote for the death of Louis XVI. and also under the time of the Revolution, is sent by Robespierre down to Lyon to suppress a royalist uprising. And he is now known as the Butcher of Lyon. He ties people together. He gets 20,000 troops, revolutionary troops, to massacre people. He tries to dispatch people quickly, so he ties them together in groups with chains and then tries to sort of, bludgeon them to death, and that doesn't work. You get these groups of dying people. He's absolutely atrocious, and he also is the first person who develops the idea of de-Christianization. Because he'd worked in the church, he knew all of the what each church had, and so he is instrumental in pulling down the pieces from the altar pieces, smashing the windows, and pulling the statues down, and actually putting, death is an eternal sleep, there is no God, this sort of thing. So, however, he falls out with Robespierre over Robespierre's obsession with this idea of the supreme being. Fouché wants some other kind of philosophical ideal, which theoretically is now a secret society, but Dan Brown isn't onto that one yet, but it's that sort of thing. He and falls out, and so manoeuvres to get rid of Robespierre. And Robespierre knows he's being manoeuvred against by Fouché. Fouché, night and day, they can't catch him. He is so clever. His traces are always kept. In fact, he even writes his own memoirs, which are certainly falsified, so that you never know what he ever did, even though he published all these things. Do you know what I mean? You never know anything about him. So he manages to get Robespierre. Robespierre has a nervous breakdown and is basically dispatched. Then, of course, you have Napoleon coming to power. Fouché networks him. He's there at the 18th of Brumaire with Lucien, with Murat, and is rewarded by Napoleon as becoming the chief of police. Yeah? Now, he's going to set up the structure of the modern police force and the modern spy agency, right? He is the person who he networks all different people at the same time. He has no allegiance to anyone, all right? Even though he's working with Napoleon, he's working against him with all of the people who are against him. So he's working with the royalists against Napoleon, he's working with the Napoleons against Okay, look, I'll remember that. Is working against the revolutionaries, so he will eventually turn against all of these people. So already he's turned against the church, he's turned against the royalists, and now he's going to turn against his own Jacobins as well. He has all of his friends who were the revolutionaries, he has them massacred as well, all right? Now, as chief of police, he's the person who understands to catch a thief, you need a thief. And he, as the person who employs Vidocq, the great criminal who has escaped from the hulks 3 or 4 times, and he employs him as his chief spy. So he has the most extraordinary spy network. He knows all the dirt on the Napoleonic family and Napoleon. Napoleon is so scared of him that he wants to get rid of him, but he's too scared to do it. And so he doesn't get rid of Fouché, he gets rid of the position. So he says, look, I don't really need a chief of police. However, will you go to the south of France? Here's a castle. You're a senator for life. Hundreds of thousands of dollars as well. Well, Fouché accepts this as a kind of compromise. Yes, before he goes, he burns his records, but makes sure he keeps all his spy network. So he comes back into power at the time when he's getting rid of the Directoire. He's supposed to get rid of them, but he gets a safe passage for Barras because he might need Barras later. Do you know what I mean? It's always, everything's carefully done. In 1800, there's a plot which is hatched to blow up Napoleon, and so Napoleon needs him back as chief of police. So he comes back. I've done the 18 Brumaire, sorry, I'll leave it there. As Napoleon, of course, his star fades, or he's over fighting the Austrians, Fouché is left in charge of Paris and negotiates with the British very successfully. Napoleon's furious, and he comes back and realises that Fouché actually wants power for himself. Anyway, he's sent out into exile again, where he networks with the Austrians against Napoleon, he networks with the Prussians against Napoleon. Finally, he comes back at the time of the 100 Days when Napoleon is defeated and immediately negotiates with the Bourbon. So by the time Napoleon is in exile in St. Helena, who do we have as chief of police? Again, for the third time, it's Fouché, who is as inscrutable as ever. Now, he's made a fortune out of provisioning the army. Remember, this is what one did. In fact, you saw in the papers the other day that the Defence Force are investigating people who supply the army. It's big bucks. And he's made millions and millions of dollars. He's one of now the wealthiest men in France after having risen from utter poverty, from total obscurity, and is probably the most powerful man in Europe because he has diplomatic ties working with the British behind the back of Napoleon, working with the Prussians. He manages all of these things. Now, his arch enemy was Talleyrand. Now, Talleyrand is Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord. All right, now if you have Fouché, who is a rather sort of prudish, aesthetic man, he's faithful to his wife, at least that's got one thing in his favour. You have this sensualist who is a great womanizer, a man of aristocratic birth who really represents the culture of the 18th century, the culture, the wit and charm of the salon. He was born into a very wealthy aristocratic family, but had a congenital limp, which meant he couldn't actually take up arms, and so of course he's put into the church, and because of family connections, even though he's an atheist virtually, he becomes the Bishop of Autun. And at one of the feasts of the Federation, there is Talleyrand as bishop. All right, now, again, I'll talk about this castle in a minute, exactly the same thing as Fouché, both of them out of the church. So therefore they know how the church operates, and so they know how to despoil the church even better. Now, Napoleon, he becomes a great diplomat for Napoleon, and the jury is a little bit out on Talleyrand. Did he change sides constantly because he was really trying to save France, or was he actually just trying to save his own skin? One thing is certain is that all of the great diplomatic coups that were pulled off via Talleyrand, but he made an awful lot of money out of it. For example, at the time, the Treaty of Lunéville, where all of the states around in the Rhineland were being taken from the young, the small petty rulers, Talleyrand manages to sell off land on the other side of the Rhine to these same people and make a fortune. At the time of the reunification of the Rhine and the Federation of the Rhine, again he does the same thing, manages to manoeuvre and sell off land, becomes immensely wealthy. As chief diplomat, and by the time of the Empire, he is the chief chamberlain, and you see him here in the painting of the Sac. That's Talleyrand who is there. Napoleon forces him to marry his longtime mistress, to make things look good, and gives him this Chateau de Valençay, where he has the most extraordinary banquets. And he really, in many ways, is the sophisticated front of the empire. Now, Napoleon, even though when he became emperor, he goes back to the etiquette and all of this sort of thing, he doesn't have the class to pull it off, whereas this fellow from the Ancien Régime can do it. So Napoleon gives him the castle, and Talleyrand hires the services of the great chef Carême, right, the great chef of the 19th century, and asks Carême to produce a different meal for every single day of the year. And this is when Carême produces these extraordinary pièces montées, kind of architectural things in the centre of tables. And so the table of Talleyrand, the table of the empire, becomes famous throughout Europe. So he's extremely useful to Napoleon from that point of view. However, he has a major falling out with Napoleon over the war in Spain, and while Napoleon is actually down there on the peninsula trying to sort things out and save his brother Joseph, he hears that horror of horrors, the arch enemies Fouché and Talleyrand have been seen conversing together at a soirée in Paris. And as someone actually sort of said it was le vice appuyé sur le crime. They were walking along, one limping, and the other one was vice leaning on crime. Napoleon comes back, and there's a huge splat about this. It's all to do about who is going to succeed Napoleon. And this is when Napoleon gives that extraordinary expression, to Talleyrand, "You're nothing but shit in a silk stocking." Talleyrand's face doesn't alter. He's the consummate 18th century courtier, and as Napoleon storms out, Talleyrand turns to the rest of the people and said, "It's such a pity that such a great man is so badly brought up." That, of course, is the end of their connection. Now, Talleyrand makes a fortune selling all of the secrets of Napoleon to Alexander of Russia. And to some degree, the disaster of that campaign is due to the betrayal of Talleyrand. Alexander didn't think he even had a chance that he could win. He was going to sign treaties with Napoleon. Talleyrand says, no, I can tell you how to do it. And so he actually plays a major role in undermining the treaties and the political manoeuvring of Napoleon. When the Bourbons come back into power, he is brought back as Prime Minister of Louis XVIII. So there you have him working with Fouché, right, his arch enemy, right, who also had voted the death of the king. They now are there in power. And they have all survived Napoleon, whom they've really comprehensively done in. So this then is Napoleon, the propaganda paintings, which are now going to be painted of Napoleon at this time when you have now Fouché and Talleyrand back in power. We have a sagging, demoralised man who is certainly a long way from that dashing figure on the horse or on the at the Battle of Arcole. But that really isn't the image that we probably maintain in our minds. The image that we have of Napoleon are two, I think. And one is the Battle of the Marengo on the horse going over the Alps, but particularly the coronation figure where he is centre stage in that extraordinary panoply at the highest moment of his glory. So in many ways, the other people might have survived him in time and politically, but probably eternally and historically, Napoleon has won the day. And in fact, there is evidently more written about Napoleon than anyone else in the world, with the exception of Jesus Christ. And that brings us to our last slide, which is Napoleon has this wonderful saying, "From the sublime to the ridiculous, there is only one step." And at the moment, what is being cooked up in Paris is Napoleon Land. This will be outside Disneyland. It is a multi-million-dollar theme park which has everything from kids to big kids. In other words, men can go out there and reenact the battles. Reenactment of Napoleonic battles is big, big business. Hundreds of thousands of people attend the battles of reenactment of Waterloo. So you can hire the costumes, you can do a little mini battle, all of these different, here of course is Venice, which of course he took over. Here we have Notre Dame, here we've got the Colosseum. I'm not quite sure what we've got this enormous bee over here. We've got the Napoleonic eagle here. So Napoleon probably didn't just survive through that wonderful painting, but he's gone planet-wide through modern technology. So that's my boy.